This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, late doctoral students, and everyone in between, culture workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Ashanté Reese, who teaches in the Department of African American Studies at the University of Texas, Austin. In addition to a number of scholarly and popular articles, she is the author of Black Food Geographies, Race, Self-Reliance, and Food Access in Washington, D.C. from 2019, and the co-editor with Hannah Garth of Black Food Matters, Racial Justice in the Wake of Food Justice from 2020. In this conversation, we discuss the place of ethnographic research in Black studies, the relationship between teaching, scholarship, and racialized space in disciplinary and non-disciplinary places, and the politics of community work as a form of Black study and practice. Hello, Ashanté. Welcome to the Black Studies Podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm good. Thank you for having me.
I'm super happy that you made time for the podcast. We go back a handful or so years, and I love your work. I love the diversity of ways you approach the questions that you engage. And for me, it's such, in some ways, your research is really exemplary Black studies research. And so I'm really interested to hear you talk about it, hear you talk about the field, and just for all of us to get a sense of your ideas and your vision. So thank you for your time, and also thank you in advance for the thoughtfulness. I think it's a really valuable set of reflections you're going to bring to the series.
Thank you.
So I thought, as a way of getting started, rather than jump immediately into, sort of how do you think about Black studies and your work, just to ask you to narrate, if you would, how you came to the study of Black life. Like, what motivated you, what cultivated your interests and your passions, what keeps you committed, and what drew you to the field of Black studies?
Yeah, this is such a great question. I think I would start answering this question by just sharing a little bit about how I grew up, because I think it is not as common maybe amongst other scholars, but I grew up in East Texas, small town, population 6,300 now. It was around 7,400 when I was growing up. And where I grew up and where my family lived, where my mother still lives, there's a dirt road that's about 3.2 miles, and it connects the highway, basically. It had never been paved in any of our lifetimes, and it's almost exclusively Black, or at least when I was growing up. It's changing a little bit now. And so it is that when you think of, like, when people talk about Zora Neale Hurston in Eatonville and this Black town, that is a version of how I grew up. All of that. Like, my neighbors were Black. They were family. We didn't lock our doors. There was a lot of intra-community bartering kind of things. And so that informed my life for the first 18 years. I mean, most of the time, the only time I saw white people is when I went to school. And then I go home, and then there's no more white people. And it makes me think about how Kevin Quashie talks about imagining the totality of a Black world. I'm like, I can imagine it. Like, I lived some of that. So when I went to college in San Antonio at Trinity University, it was the first time I'd ever lived in a big city. And it was the first time that I was living somewhere where there wasn't a Black majority. And so kind of two things happened. I was obsessed with cities and being in a place that was so big, right? Like the neighborhood or the census tract had more people than where I grew up in my whole town. So that was happening. And at the same time, I was at Trinity. And in my incoming class, this might be a little moment of trauma for me, but in my incoming class of 691, there were 8 Black students total. And I remember looking around like, I have no idea what I just got myself into. What does it mean for me to be here? And there were 4 Black professors at the time on campus when I started. And I was an English major. We would read all these things. There was maybe 2 classes on African American literature. I took those, and then I had nothing else to take. And so the second year, there was a professor who came in history, and we became really good. I mean, maybe friends isn't the right word when I was an undergrad, but we developed a relationship and a bond, and I became a history major. And they slowly developed an African American Studies minor. But all of that is what I realize now is when I was going to undergrad, I didn't have these big plans for my life. I wasn't trying to be a doctor or anything like that. I knew I liked to read. I knew I liked to write. And I felt like I can do that in pretty much any department. But getting to that place that was like more white than I'd ever experienced, I felt like I was like chasing after some evidence of Blackness anywhere. And that became in my studies, honestly. And so it was kind of ironic that I became a history major because the only class I ever got a C in high school was history pretty consistently. I hated it. And so when I would go back home and say I was a history major, people would be like, what is this about? But I think something shifts between high school and college history, right? Like there's so much more thinking about how history is constructed and who gets to tell the story versus these are just dates and facts. And so that's where my origins started. Home first and then going to college where it was mostly white. And then I decided after teaching middle school, I taught middle school in an overwhelmingly Black school district in Atlanta. I taught all girls at Coretta Scott King Young Women's Leadership Academy. And another example of this kind of Black world, very different from my own, right? But like almost all Black teachers, Black students, and they were experiencing, at the time, Atlanta was in the process of closing all of their public housing projects. And so what we were watching every day is our student population dwindling. And sometimes we would not even know where students were going because they had relocated. And there was no one was really keeping track in that way, right? I literally had students who came to sleep on my floor for several weeks just to try to stay in their school before they ended up having to move. So this sparked a lot of questions for me around just how cities function, who's most vulnerable in cities, and what do we do about it. And I would say this is the last thing I'll say about the origin. It's also teaching at that middle school where I started asking questions about food because students were asking me questions about food and I didn't have answers to them, right? So like a very profound question with two students that I used to coach the track team, and I was taking them to get a physical exam, and after they came to my house to eat dinner, and they had gone to the grocery store with me, and while we're sitting at the table, we're having lots of conversations, like, what does it mean to sit around a table and eat together? And at the time, Miss Reese, what is this food you're prepared for us? We don't know what this is, and should we eat it? But the conversation kind of led into this question of, why is your grocery store so nice? And I was like, it's just a grocery store. I mean, I think I literally said it's just a grocery store. And one of the students, I'll never forget this, she just kind of stops and she looks across the table at me and she says, it's not just a grocery store. And we started a conversation around what was in their neighborhood, what wasn't. And I remember that night feeling really silly that like something that felt every day to me in my neighborhood was something that I had never thought of as not being a part of theirs, which was only about 3.5 miles away. And so when I decided to go to grad school, that's what I decided I would think a lot about. Initially, I was interested in health. Then I got away from that quite a bit. But those students' questions became some of the questions I decided I would like take up what feels like now for the rest of my career.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, that question, or not question, that comment, it sort of disoriented me. This is just not a normal grocery store, or wasn't normal. It was not a regular grocery store.
Yeah.
That's the birth of like multi-generational work. I mean, to reckon with that comment. That's not very many words, but an entire world and history and memory is embedded in that middle school phrase. That's right. That middle schooler's phrase. That's wild.
Yeah, I mean, you've got a 12-year-old. And I think what I was also feeling that night after I'd taken them home was just this way that, I'm the teacher on some level. But in that moment, in that conversation, like I was very much the student. I was learning so much from them. And I was also realizing how I think that maybe was my second year living in Atlanta, which means at that point, probably my 6th year living in a city versus the 18 years that I hadn't grown up in a city. I was also really thinking about what these constructions of place meant for my own understanding and how they were very different from these kids I was teaching. And it was really fascinating to really start to think like, oh, yes, like, growing up in a town that has 2 grocery stores is very different. Right? Because you go to one or the other versus growing up in a city where you literally can drive from neighborhood to neighborhood and see that the resources are vastly different. And so, yeah, that was it, and I think that 7th grade year, the second year I taught 7th grade, and part of the curriculum was learning about Martin Luther King Jr. and civil disobedience and I said, okay, well, let's just do an exercise in class. If we were going to plan some form of civil disobedience around a topic, what would it be? And so they brainstormed all these topics, and across all the classes, the cafeteria was the one that they really were like, we don't love the food in the cafeteria. It's not healthy. We want more options. So, 24-year-old teacher, I'm like, all right, cool. That was such a great exercise. And some of the students were like, okay, so now we're going to do it? Are we going to boycott the cafeteria? And I was like, no, we're not going to do that. And they insisted. And so I said, we will do it. And I have one rule. Everyone has to eat. If someone cannot bring food from home for whatever reason, someone else has to pick up the slack. But the minute I go in the cafeteria and someone doesn't have anything to eat, it's off. And they're like, okay. So it was amazing to watch these kids bringing extra food, extra peanut butter and jelly sandwich, extra leftovers. Now looking back on it, I wonder what their parents thought they were doing. I don't know if they talked to their parents about it, but they did this for several weeks. And the principal came to me one day and was like, they have to stop. And I was like, I don't know what you mean. She's like, they have to stop. Because they're not, I guess the counters in the cafeteria are not recording lunches, we're going to lose staff in the cafeteria if students are not eating. And I was like, that is a big deal. And I think that means somebody needs to come and talk to them about what it is that they're asking for, because I don't think they want to stop. I sound so calm now, but at the time I was freaking out that I was also about to lose my job because I'm aiding and abetting this.
I'm freaking out about where this is going to turn because I was like, I hope you didn't end up.
I didn't. I kept my job, but they, the person who was over the district's kind of food person actually came to campus and met with representatives from each of the classes, along with the president or the principal, and the students got to present. They practiced these presentations that they were going to do. They got to present on what they were asking for, why they were asking for it, and how they thought it would help them be better students. And so in the long run, they ended up getting some changes, including a salad bar that was consistent in the cafeteria. And then on Fridays, I think it was Fridays, they always had pizza, and they wanted an option that wasn't pizza. Like, yes, still have pizza, but can we have another option for people who don't want to have pizza? So that was I'm always so proud of them. They're almost 30 now, but I'm always so proud when I'm telling the story about them because Seriously? I'm like, this was so cool. It was all orchestrated by them. I just helped them facilitate what they wanted to do. And even though, Black Studies is not necessarily something we think about as associated with K through 12, that was probably my first real Black Studies moment of really taking the reading and theories that we were talking about and marrying it with practice in a way that could make real change in the lives of those kids. But also, the best part of it for me, was just how they came together as a community. I remember going to the cafeteria one day and I could see someone hadn't been able to bring their lunch, and watching kids scrambling, getting things from other people and be like, no, here, you can have this. You can have this for my lunch. You can have this. It's just the most beautiful thing.
The practicing community in the way that, adults struggle even in very, very small contexts too. It's amazing. There's so many things. I feel like this, podcast could end right now and be more than worth it. That's a phenomenal story. I mean, the human part is the most important, but it's also a reminder of I mean, for me, like of a couple of things. One is just the power of conversation. That when we talk to people, that entire lives are changed through the exchange of words.
Yeah.
The way those words manifest a world, create discomfort, hostility, anger, impatience, and new things happen. But also, you said it, and I was thinking it as you were talking about, this being a Black Studies moment, and that's one of these moments of thinking about Black Studies as more than an area of inquiry and as like an entire sensibility.
Yeah.
Because this conversation that you were having over dinner about a grocery store turns into like a political awakening for them. I mean, awakening, I don't know what they were like before, but a political moment for them. I mean, seventh graders having power over anything is so transformative. And this is power over their bodies and their environment and their space that's supposed to care for them. Right. And how does care show up around race, class, and city space, geography. So, I mean, that's it's like a huge chunk of Black Studies you just described as happening in conversation and action. I love that.
Yeah. And it's, I think, you mentioned race and class, and, these kids were overwhelmingly poor kids, right? And so just imagining and thinking about, and I don't use that in a negative sense at all. Like, these were kids that were just coming from areas of Atlanta where the resources were low. Their parents were working really hard, not making enough money. But it meant something even more that these were kids who were the ones who enacted this particular change at this school. Because there was so much messaging that said what they couldn't be, who they couldn't be, what they couldn't do, and they got a W. That is it. Like, they gotta win. And I'm not gonna lie, I was as shocked as maybe they were, because we know how these things can work sometimes. And my school had some really sometimes unfair disciplinary practices, honestly. So I was a little worried, but I was so happy for them. I was so happy for them.
It's a long-lasting win too. It says something about like their possibilities despite their conditions. Yeah, and in terms of addressing, transforming, and I mean, they knew those disciplinary actions too, so taking a risk. It's always wild when you think about discouraging, protest at a place named after the King family. But I won't go on with other examples. We could proliferate, but these ironies or something. But I love that the kids got to manifest the name of the school. I love that. Yeah,
it's a beautiful moment.
Well, let me ask you about the field of Black Studies, and you work in a department now, and so I want to get a sense of your imagination of the field. Like, what's your conception of what we do? Because the field has a tense origin. It's one of the origins is a story about breaking that boundary between intellectual life and political activism around Black liberation. Right. And so one of the imperatives of Black Studies at its origin was to be committed to this political struggle. The other origin of Black Studies is inquiry, right? To develop Black intellectual traditions, Black methodologies, to expand how we think and how we work, in our world of ideas and everything that comes from that, which has been this kind of tension between sort of life of the mind, life of political struggle. Yeah. But that was 50-something years ago, right? And we are at a different point, but also kind of at the same point. And so I think it's this question for me, for everybody in the field, sort of how do we even imagine what we're doing, this field, and what it means, and what kind of imperatives flow from it for you?
Yeah, I think, that was such a great summary of thinking about like these two tentacles of the origin stories of Black Studies. You could probably ask me this, 2 months later, and I might have a different answer. But I think where we are right now, there is
corrections. Did anything change your mind?
It was like, did anything change? I think this line of thought around inquiry is an interesting one because of the two tentacles, if we're going back to that, thinking, 50 something years ago, that is the one that I think people can do without being under an umbrella of Black studies. Like, that isn't the thing that makes Black studies for me personally.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I mean, obviously, I love all of these different things around thinking about method and thinking about who is at the center of study and like how are we theorizing. I love that. But that in the absence of political struggle feels like it's not Black studies for me. Like, I think that part of the origin story is the thing that I've kept closest to me in terms of like my own accountability as a scholar, as a thinker, as someone who wants to be a part of, or at least, if not a part of, informing work that is related to movements. And it's just been a part of my practice. And I guess the reason I think about this in this way is like, when I was in graduate school, I was in anthropology. I did not think of what I was doing as Black studies. Like, I thought of what I was doing as like an interest in Black folks, Black communities, like combating some of the myths around food and eating and healthiness. Like, I thought of it in that way. And I think I could have spent the rest of my career thinking of it in that way, and it would have been good work. It still could have had an impact. But I think what did shift for me was this thought around, for me, it wasn't enough to just do good work. I wanted to really think with and alongside organizations or movements. And I kind of like, one of the people I met, this is a little bit of a tangent, last summer started calling me the people's anthropologist. And I was like, I like that. I've got to stick with that. And I think like, I didn't even pay her to say that. But the reason I loved it is because in some ways, like in the same way that my initial questions came from the students I taught, that's kind of been the theme in terms of the kind of research that I've been doing, right? Like, initially around food access and anti-Blackness, and even now as I'm thinking about more about kind of carcerality and Blackness and sugar, like that project came from being a thought partner with folks from the National Black Food and Justice Alliance who were trying to grapple with like, how do we think about food justice and abolition together? And I'm like, that's a good question. And like, we're riffing off of each other. And I'm like, this could be a part of the toolkit. So I think about my work as if I thought about it broadly, as a part of a toolkit for people who might be doing the on the ground stuff. Right. And I'm like, I don't have to be doing the on the ground stuff, but I can do things that can be supportive of that. And I think that's important for a number of reasons. But as we all know, like, bringing Black studies into the university and codifying into departments, on some level, that's a beautiful thing, right? I get to have a benefit of that. And on another level, I do worry sometimes about the institutionalization of such, right? And like, what does it mean for us to have to consistently like legitimize our presence in the university in ways that maybe take us further and further away from radical thought and action? Actually, I see them as being connected. And so the thing that holds me accountable is trying to at least keep an ear toward what are the questions what are the dire questions that communities are asking, and how can I help? Like, it sounds that it's that simple. I mean, how can I help?
Mm-hmm. I love that. I mean, I remember when I got promoted to full with tenure, I went from visiting assistant to full with tenure. Its own story.
You have the craziest story in terms of like how you got here.
I know. I'm going to start coughing out of stress, remembering all those years of being a visitor. But I remember my beloved late colleague, Jeff Ferguson. I shared an office with him. Rest in peace, Jeff. I walked in, he stood up and gave me a big hug, and he was like, "Welcome to being a part of the problem." And I laughed because I was like, yeah, I mean, tenured full professor, you are kind of the part of the problem, right? But he said, but you're the problem, like, because now you're on the side of the institution, but you're also the problem because you have the possibility of really upsetting the institution. And I've always really held that, like, welcome to being part of the problem. And if people know Jeff, I mean, this is such a Jeff moment because, he was trying to make me stressed out, but also then sort of map out like a vision of being a Black studies professor, and how to be a problem for the university and a problem for bad. I don't know. I don't want to call it evil. I'm not in religious terms, but sometimes evil. This is that moment of, I like your way of putting it. How can I help? And your work is so deeply embedded in justice work that is part of help. I think that's a question we really all ought to ask.
Yeah, I think it's one way that I think about it. I know sometimes, as academics, some of us like to think we're kind of outside of some of the worst things of the university, but actually we're right in the middle of it. And so what I like to think is that I like to think of myself as trying to have one foot in and one foot out at all times. And sometimes that looks like hopscotching across the two, but trying to at least acknowledge and maybe sit with some of the contradictions of what it means to be in a university doing the kind of work that I do. And then also thinking about, well, I have access to these resources to do the work that I do, so why not try to funnel them in a direction that can be supportive of the work that people outside the university really find important but may not have time, resources, or capacity to do. And I'm like, yeah, that might be, I don't know if any students will be listening to this part of the podcast, but that might be the biggest thing I can say about trying to form one's identity. It's that's the greatest gift I gave to myself, which is really trying to think through who I wanted to be in relation with and how, both in terms of scholarly conversations, but people outside of the university as well. And it pretty much informs everything that I do. How the kind of committees I want to be on, all of these things, right? It's become a framework, really.
I love that. I think that's both a really fantastic vision, really I love the way you articulated it. And I think it's a challenge for all of us. I imagine it's also a constant challenge for you. These are, we get burned out on one or the other thing,
Yeah.
But it's a different set of imperatives, and I think that's the origin of Black studies. And sometimes origin stories are worth keeping alive in the present.
Yeah.
So I like that.
Yeah.
Well, let me ask you about your own sort of journey as a teacher and thinker. You have a disciplinary training, because your work's invested in ethnographic study and feminist methods, but also you do a lot of creative and community making work, which you've already spoken a bit to. And so I'm interested in, how that combination of approaches, right? How you think that relates to the past of Black studies, because some of it is sort of, the thing that's embedded in the history of the field, but also, that combination for me is really unique. So I'm also interested in how you situate your work in terms of opening new horizons. So sort of, how is it related to the past, but also how is it something new?
Oh, these are such good questions. Oh my gosh. Okay. Thinking about how it relates to the past, I think some of the earliest texts that I read that we might consider a part of Black studies, like reading Du Bois, reading his work on Philadelphia, reading how he was really grappling with numbers and statistics on one hand, but really trying to enflesh them on the other hand. And I was really fascinated with that. And I would say I've never really been oriented toward numbers, but what I have been oriented toward is how do we take all these things, statistics or whatever, how do we take them and give them human life? And I think, again, I credit some of my earliest readings of Du Bois on this, right? And so I think in terms of how I relate to the past, that would be the biggest thing. I think that's why I was drawn to ethnography, right? I can see a social problem and I can see how it's been quantified. Now I want to see how it's lived and how it's resisted and how it's experienced. I also think, I've been reading, I teach a class on black geographies, and we've been reading some of the origin stories of black geographies as a field that is kind of like exploded, especially in the last 5 years. And so many of these early thinkers, I think, straddling this line of Black studies and geography, were really interested in quantitative studies and like trying to make a case for how to do both, like really, like how to do these Black studies, or what some would have talked about as like studies of race, which is slightly different, and do it in a way that would be recognizable to a discipline. And I think part of the reason why, like, you know, I thought about applying to Berkeley's PhD in Black Studies was the only Black Studies program I thought about applying to when I was in grad school. But one thing that I worried about, you know, kind of coming full circle to the past, is like, what does it mean to even have a degree in Black Studies? I mean, this was, you know, 15 years ago at this point, but, and that's how I ended up in a traditional discipline. So some of my relation to the past of Black Studies is also that relationship to how it was or wasn't recognized as a legitimate site of inquiry, even if people were doing this really, really great work. You know, that sounds really shitty to say out loud, but it was like a real thing, a real consideration.
Yeah.
And I think in terms of the future, I definitely, you know, I feel like there's so many great thinkers and writers right now who have asked us to write and think and be different in some way. You know, we were just reading Curiosities Make My Head Swim by Catherine McKittrick in my Black Geographies class, and my students were like, what is this? I have no idea what she's trying to say. And I was like, that's perfect. I was like, that's perfect. That's part of what we were trying to experience, this unsettledness, this like, this dislodging of that we always have the answers. And I love that is a direction that Black Studies has gone in and it's going in. And I think I'm kind of following a little bit in that trajectory too. When I think about how, like, in the sugar work, using baking as a method, I had and honestly still have no idea where that is going. Like, I don't know. But I think where I think about it is really like, you know, what does an embodied form of ethnography look like from my own kitchen? What comes up, what doesn't come up, and how do I think about that in relation to these other things, these ledgers that I'm reading, these prison ledgers and these graves that I'm building, like visiting? How do all those things come together to like create something? And that something is, again, still, I don't know. But I think where Black Studies is different than it was 50 years ago is in the level of experimentation that people are doing, which I find incredibly exciting. And so that's what I want to contribute. So like baking, thinking a lot about baking, but also just like how we write. I think a lot about that. And I think in the food work and the other project on Black gatherings that I'm working on, it's also reconsidering like what sites are important to study when we're thinking about food justice. And so like, you know, Black family reunions is not going to come to mind for most people. And I want to challenge that. Like, so I'm like going to these places where we don't think of it, like they're not organizations, they're not gardens, they're not farms, but they teach us really important things around what it means to gather together, be in community, provide food, right? But I guess what I'm saying is I go to these spaces where food is assumed and it's there, but it's the least interesting part of the being to me. Mm-hmm. And so I'm like, how do I pull out the strings of the things that are interesting to me? And so there's this, I think I would not have gotten there without all these people that we read all the time who are really pushing us to experiment with how we do what we do.
I love this experimentation and curiosity as I mean, it's you're describing your own work, but I also think it's when I'm listening to you, and I imagine a lot of people listening to you, it also is its own kind of question of like, you're working in a field that has this incredible experimental and curious horizon. It's very open. Like, are you taking advantage of it? Do you want to is one thing, but also like, it's right here. What are we going to do with this? And, and maybe this is actually already an answer to the next question I had, which is, your PhD was in anthropology. Mm-hmm. And then now you work in a Black Studies department. I know you've had other jobs along the way, and you've worked in women and gender studies, in anthropology as well. So I'm curious, how you think about that movement from discipline, anthropology, to area studies, and how that's informed not only your research, but I'm also interested in how those shifts and turns and development of your career, because we don't just work a place, we actually become intellectuals in places, how it's also changed your classrooms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is such a great question. So I started my tenure track journey at Spelman College in a sociology and anthropology department. Still probably one of the most transformative experiences I've had. Just the students were very ambitious and curious, and ambitious can be a double-edged sword sometimes too, right? But ambitious in some of the best ways. And it's probably there. I would say it's probably there where I could start to imagine myself as a Black Studies scholar, because I didn't have all the constraints of what would have meant for me to be an anthropologist at a non-HBCU, for example. Being an anthropologist at Spelman was synonymous with being a Black Studies scholar in some ways, right? There were not these expectations that I had to teach a particular canon. And I did a lot of thinking and imagining around okay, what is my canon? And how do I want to teach that to students alongside of, there's some people you're going to need to know if you're going to be an anthropologist, but those people don't have to be the center in this space, right? That doesn't have to be the goal in this space. So how do I reimagine that? That was amazing. I enjoyed doing that quite a lot. And I co-taught a class with Cynthia Neal Spence where she's a sociologist, I was an anthropologist, and we took these themes that we wanted to teach, and we pulled books from each of our respective fields to really think about how are these sociologists and anthropologists talking to each other, at each other, across each other, et cetera. And it was so fun. It was so fun to think about a scholar who is from a different generation than me, a different discipline than I am, and the text that she chose and then the text that I chose, somehow they came together really beautifully, and we would read these books each week with these students. It was a small group of students, and it was wonderful. And I loved that. I love that freedom. So much of I think of academic life right now is characterized by an anxiety of us losing our freedoms. But Spelman was a place where I just felt really free to teach how I want to teach. And I felt really free to, and I felt trusted to teach what I wanted to teach. And so, I love.
Probably could be on a commercial for Spelman right there. I like.
Yeah, that. I mean, it was.
Really real though.
It's really real, and people ask often, well, if you loved it so much, why would you leave Spelman? And there are lots of ways I can answer this question, but I would say, it had nothing to do with my colleagues or my teaching experience at all. It had everything to do with, I finished my first book and I sat down and I had this moment of fear that I would never produce another book. And I was like, oh my God, but this is so important to me. And part of that fear was that moment that I think many scholars come to where you start to think about okay, this place where I'm teaching 3 courses a semester, or my salary is this, or I don't get a research budget, what impact does that have on me continuing to be the kind of writer and scholar that I want to be? And that's where I landed. And I was like, oh my gosh, I have to make a really difficult decision. So yeah, 4 years at Spelman, I think, was intellectually a really rich place for me, both as a teacher and as a scholar. And I think getting here, went to UMBC for a year, thought I was never going to leave UMBC. That's the thing. Some people have these upward trajectories. I did not. I was I just want to go somewhere and do my work, have the resources that I need to do my work. But I did end up leaving after a year because this position in Black Studies became available. But I don't think I would have even applied to Black Studies position without my job at Spelman. I just don't think I would have thought that I was... Yeah, I don't think I would have thought that I was person that they were looking for at all. But I think, again, because I had this freedom to read as widely as I want and to like relate it to my discipline of origin, it meant that I had read so many things that I hadn't read prior to then, that started to inform my thinking more. So I'm always grateful to Spelman that was my first spot, right? Like I landed in a really good first place. And then being here, like it is another place where I feel the kind of freedom, a similar freedom in terms of teaching what I want, developing the classes that I want. And, I think Black Studies departments can be a little challenging sometimes because different from like a traditional field where you're like, we're anthropologists and we kind of all know what that means. Sometimes in Black Studies, we don't all know what that means, right? We're not working with the same definitions. And so sometimes that can be challenging.
By the way. That's this podcast series. I mean, really, it's like, what are we doing?
Real. Exactly? What are we doing? And how do we relate to each other? But I think for anyone who's interested in interdisciplinarity, which I am interested in, I've always been interested in, this kind of space has been perfect for that. Like learning from my scholars who are in theater, my colleagues who are in theater and dance and like, sure, traditional disciplines like history and sociology, but like, it's been really cool. And I think going back to your earlier question around like, when we were thinking about the origins, when I think of my department, I think of an umbrella that is holding all of that, including the tensions, right? But holding all of that, people who are really approaching Black Studies as a catch-all for anything that has to do with Blackness and Black life, and other people who are like, the political activism part of Black Studies needs to be there, and then everything in between. And then you get and with that, you get everything, like all kinds of things that come out of that, all kinds of tensions and fights and agreements and all that kind of stuff. But the one thing you don't get is anyone questioning if the work is relevant or significant or urgent. I love that. That is the best thing about being in this department.
That's no small bit of liberation in Black Studies, having been in philosophy departments trying to teach Caribbean and African-American materials, the constant fight to be like, no, this is worthy of philosophical consideration, instead to turn around. And if there was any debate, it was like, how much should we emphasize the philosophical tradition in the U.S. or wherever I was working? And, one question is better than the other.
Yes.
Say that.
Yeah, and my grad program, I've written about this before. I love to tell this story now. It was painful at the time. But my first year of my grad program, we would, first years were invited to do these brown bag talks around like work they were doing in a class or whatever. And I had done this in the second semester of my first year and did a presentation, and two professors in my department basically said, "You're not a real anthropologist." And to a first year student, right? Both of these people were people who I was supposed to have asked to be on my dissertation committee. I never asked them. But
that salvaged the relationship.
It was really rough. And I was like, and I think, when I tell the story, the thing I emphasize is it's you're not a real anthropologist that's coming from them, but it is also how that comment, and which was a first comment in the room, silenced everybody else in the room.
Interesting, yeah.
And no one else knew what to say after that. And then there's me at the top of the room who's going through my thoughts around like, don't look defensive, don't cross your arms, all the things, like all the stereotypes that are associated with, Black women. And I'm running through them literally in my head as I'm like getting this. I mean, they were feeding off of each other, just kind of dagger after dagger after dagger. And several years ago, maybe it's like 3 years ago now, I revisited that moment. I wrote this thing for Anthropology News, and I ended with like, I am not a real anthropologist. And that's cool. Thank you. There was something that was not comfortable about that moment. But 10 years, 12 years later, I have a very different perspective on it, because essentially what they were telling me without telling me was that I was not conforming to the discipline. And that was true. I wasn't conforming to the discipline. And in their view, or at least my interpretation of their view, is that the discipline wasn't capacious enough to expand to like include what I was doing.
Mhm.
And so I had to think differently around what I was doing. Now, what was also interesting about this, 3 days after this, I got an NSF award. And I was like, take that. I got, like telling me I'm not a real anthropologist. I just got this award, this grant for being an anthropologist. But in we maybe don't talk about it enough and as honestly as we should. But in academics, so much of academia is about belonging too, being claimed by someone, claiming people as a part of your lineage. And I felt excluded. I didn't feel like I belonged in that space. And so, I think about Spelman, I think about where I am now, like those are just not things that I'm preoccupied with. Like I'm not worried about belonging because these places, at least these two places, have been like, there is space for you here. Like these departments or this HBCU, this is you belong here. And that's no small thing. We act like we don't care about that stuff, but like it's not a small thing.
I never understand why people act like they don't care. Of course we care.
Of course we care. Of course
we have feelings too.
Exactly.
But I have to say, not to turn this into some speculative religious conversation, but that is some angelic intervention that you got that NSF.
Oh, it was the best.
I just,
oh my God, it was the best.
generations go by waiting for a moment like that. I can't believe you got to have it. That's just,
it was
beautiful.
And, in a very material way, too, it meant that I didn't have to be a TA in my department. It liberated me from my department, actually.
Yeah.
Where I interacted on my own terms and not on the terms set by like my funding or anything, because I wasn't funded by them anymore. And that was a gift. Like that was such a gift. And so like, I mostly avoided those folks for the rest of my program, and I was able to because I didn't have to answer to them for anything.
Beautiful. I love that story. I really, really love that story. I'm gonna come back to that as a happy place for a while. That's really satisfying. It didn't happen to me, but it happened to a friend. That's more than enough. So let me ask you, and I've two final questions for you. One about past Black studies, and the other about the present and future. So first, when you think about the field of Black studies, what do you think that it's done particularly well? But also, what do you think it has not done particularly well?
Yeah. I think what it has done really well, which is probably like just a very like mundane thing, which is just like this steady insistence that Black thought and Black being matter, and they can be the center of inquiry like that, and they can be the center of inquiry without it having to be relative to whiteness. I think that's a really important thing. It doesn't always have to be relative to whiteness. That's a really important thing. I also think, especially when I'm thinking about like departments, I've met a lot of people, not a lot, but I've met several people who have either gotten PhDs through Black Studies programs or teaching in them, who are some of the sharpest people I've met in terms of making connections across fields. And I think partially because to be in Black Studies and be of Black Studies, you really do kind of have to know a little bit about a lot of things, like to be able to make some connections. And that I love that part of Black Studies and love being in the Black Studies department, seeing these students start to be able to like draw these webs, right? They're not always like deep, like there's not always like the deep lineage as if you were in just a like traditional field, but there's something beautiful about seeing people think expansively. And I think Black Studies encourages us to do that. What I don't think, I'm trying to decide how much of a hot take I want to have right now. What do I think Black Studies hasn't done well?
So I love hot takes, but that's up to you. You're the guest.
I think one kind of, very specific to my field, I think Black Studies has not done a good job of taking food studies seriously. I think that there is so much room, and I think the same has been true for food studies, or had been true for food studies, that wasn't taking Blackness and Black studies seriously. I think food studies has made some movement in ways that Black studies has not. And that really concerns me in this context of climate disaster, climate change. I think Black studies has a lot to say about land and agriculture and food and community and all this, and I want more people saying it. And I get surprised when I'm reading certain things in Black studies that takes food for granted or has these really pithy analyses where I'm like, come on, like we have a critical edge that we can offer to how we're engaging food. And so I think that's something we haven't done well. I think in this present moment, I don't know if this is true in other fields, so this might not be unique to Black studies, but I certainly am following it more closely in Black studies. We have not done a good job of guarding against celebrityism in our fields, in our atmosphere. I don't even know what doing a good job would mean, but the reason it comes up for me is that I notice sometimes with my own students, with my grad students, they will read who is popular and whose names are out there, and then there's so much other stuff that they maybe miss or ignore. And I have a lot of concerns about that too. So I don't know what that means. Like, I don't know if that's a field thing or is that something that is happening in academia, but it is something that I notice. And the last thing I will say is I think Black feminist scholars working in Black studies traditions do a lot to really help us understand patriarchy and misogyny, etc. I don't think we have done well internally with really grappling enough with patriarchy and misogyny.
For what it's worth, I think what all three of those things you described, I think, are absolute crises. I mean, I might be even more hot takey than you, but also this is only audio. But we've both been present visually to each other as you're talking about this. I think we're both letting out the deepest silent sighs.
Yeah.
But these things get to a point of crisis. When you take them seriously, and so. It's a lot for one person to take on, and there are other people too. But these are all areas in which you are changing the field. So write more, publish more, talk more, put more demands on you.
Can I actually finish these books I'm writing? And then but I think this podcast, right? Like when you invited me and thinking about what this podcast can mean, what the entire series could mean, and all of that. I will say, and I'm not just saying this because you're my friend, but that is the kind of institution building that can happen in, but not of the university, right? That is the kind of thing that I think can be really, really important and valuable because there's all kinds of forms of institution building. We all try to, we get in where we fit in. But this is something that can stand on its own, that you left UMD tomorrow, your department folded tomorrow. This is something that is a gift that keeps on giving, that wasn't just about pouring back into the university. I love that. And I think a lot about this too, in terms of we get through our first books, we get tenure, we write a few more if we're lucky. But, part of the Black studies tradition in my mind too is we leave more than our scholarship, and I do think we all have to grapple with what that means. It's obviously something that we, probably people think about on some level, and it's something that I'm thinking about. And I think one of the things that I feel really strongly about in terms of, okay, what can I leave behind? And some of it is a question around how do we do what we do? I am slightly obsessed with methods and how we come to the answers that we come to, or at least come to the offerings that we want to put out in the world. And so it's shifted. So you asked earlier about teaching, and I didn't really say much about it, but it's shifted how I teach. Now I've oriented my teaching toward methods a lot, actually. My grad, I only teach methods courses for grad classes. And even now with undergrads, like teaching, even my Black geographies class is kind of oriented around like how things are made and unmade. And it's been really beautiful. But that's where I see, and that to me can look a lot of different ways, and it doesn't have to be a book. And right now it's currently like how I pour into what I teach, and hopefully these people who go on to do their own research in their own writing feel like they have permission to think more expansively around method than even I felt like I did when I was in grad school. That feels like a really, relative to those questions that I'm talking about. I'm like, the things that we haven't done well, like I notice them, and then I'm like, okay, well then here's my little sliver of how maybe I can sow seeds for it to be done better or differently.
Mm-hmm. I love that. And my final question, maybe picking up with this pouring into, because we pour into with intention, right? With the question, with an aim. So last question for you, what do you think? And obviously I don't mean this in any kind of imperial sense, but just like to get inside the heart of your political urgency and intellect. What is the question that you think we should all be asking? What's most urgent for us to be thinking about in this moment as Black Studies people?
Oh my gosh. The thing that comes to mind immediately is how can we be useful? I know everyone doesn't agree. I will say this about myself. Reading theory outside of like thinking about what it means for the world and how it can be applicable doesn't make sense to me. Like it's a hard sell for me. So I think this idea of how can we be useful, it can, that's a question of scale. That can be from your classroom, it can be university, it can be outside of that. But, thinking about those origin stories, like we can frame it a lot in a lot of different ways. But I think a lot of these early thinkers and architects were asking this question of how can I be useful? And I still think that is probably the most relevant question. Not how can I help my students get a job, even though that's important. How can I be useful, and how do I convey that urgency to other people? Because I think at the heart of, I'm going to get on a little bit of a soapbox, but at the heart of what is wrong, I think what is wrong, a lot of what is wrong right now in kind of U.S. American politics and culture is hyper-individualism on some level. There's a lot of other things wrong, but that kind of I'm out here for myself, by myself is a real challenge. And I think this question of how can I be useful almost always orients us back toward a we. And I think about how Christina Sharp talks about, part of our urgency is writing into a we that is both Black and global. And I think I take that very seriously. And if we take writing out of it and just say, being into a we, or doing into a we, that feels very urgent to me.
I love that. That's just an amazing place to end, because it puts a lot of questions at all of our doorsteps to sit and think about and orient ourselves toward. And, like I said at the outset, thank you for your time and your thoughtfulness. I really just appreciate the way you've opened up really generous, but also really difficult questions for us, and being Black Studies professors and parts of a world that care about the lives of Black people. And, I can't wait for people to listen to this. I think it's going to provoke a lot of thinking and conversation. And that's because you took this really seriously and were so thoughtful about it. So thank you for all of that.
Thank you.
All right. Well, have a great rest of your day, and take care.
Thanks.